Thank you, sir. John Sitilides, if you'd like to come join us, continue our presentation. Thank you, Senator Baird, Congressman Baird.
Great. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Congressman Pittenger, and never an easy thing to follow a member of Congress up here, but I just want to take a few moments, ladies and gentlemen, and build on some of the points that Christian laid out for you earlier in terms of the overview of the challenges that we're facing. And what I'd like to do is maybe sharpen the focus a little bit and speak specifically about the degree to which the Russian invasion of Ukraine is or is not influencing China's calculations involving Taiwan, and really see how we can more sharply link the Indo-Pacific to the invasion of Ukraine. And it's a question that we're asking here with greater frequency because this war in Ukraine has played out now for 3 years, going on 4 years if we don't have a ceasefire by February. And the question is often being asked here, to what extent are our actions in Ukraine influencing Beijing's calculations towards Taiwan? And from all indications, I will tell you, in my own opinion, not much. Ukraine is a factor, but it is by far not the overwhelming factor, or even within the series of overwhelming factors in Beijing. And that may be surprising to many of you because we have been following a Western press that is largely ignoring the realities of how Beijing views its own interests in Taiwan, in the Indo-Pacific, and across the global economy. Now, I think Beijing is learning lessons from what is happening in Ukraine. They see a U.S. and NATO alliance that to date has been largely resilient, but I think the political will is starting to dissipate. Certainly here in the United States, after a $175 billion obligation to Ukraine over the last several years, and we're seeing a number of European societies now becoming increasingly skeptical about ongoing support for Ukraine at the levels we've seen in prior years. We know that our military stockpiles are being depleted here in the United States in supporting not only Ukraine, but also supporting Israel in its wars against Iran, playing out in Gaza, in Lebanon, and in the Red Sea against the Houthis. But even the Ukrainians have become weary of the war. And I don't know if you've seen the recent Gallup poll that came out about a week or so ago. 52% of Ukrainians in unoccupied Ukraine would like an end to the war as soon as possible, compared to 38% who would like the war to continue. And we know, of course, that Ukraine's economy has been decimated by the war. The 20% of Ukrainian territory in the eastern oblasts are probably lost for the foreseeable future, as is Crimea. And even President Zelensky now is saying maybe he's willing to give up maximal aims to regain that territory in order to enter into peace negotiations with Putin, even if that means that they won't be able to achieve NATO membership in the immediate future, but at least have some pathway in that direction. So I think it's very important to be realistic about what is happening and what has not been happening in Ukraine. And China is certainly watching all of this very closely to learn lessons about how wars are conducted, the extent of American and European political will to stand by a commitment to defend a country that is being invaded. And I want to emphasize, sort of apart from Ukraine, ladies and gentlemen, what are the major calculations in Beijing besides what is happening with the Russian invasion of Ukraine? First of all, keep in mind that Xi Jinping, since coming to power in 2012, has been very clear that his regime will stand for the national rejuvenation of China. And that means what they call, what the Chinese Communist Party calls, the reunification of Taiwan with China. Now, we all know that Taiwan has never been a part of the People's Republic of China, but this is, again, the propaganda that we hear coming, and be very careful whenever you hear someone speaking about the reunification of Taiwan with China. That's communist propaganda. It is not based in historical fact. But if Xi Jinping is able to accomplish his goal, he sees himself as joining Mao Zedong in the pantheon of the greatest Chinese leaders, so he has a personal interest in achieving this longer-term goal. There's also, of course, the ability to absorb Taiwan's advanced semiconductor manufacturing capacity. This helps China more rapidly achieve its own technology goals, as stated by two strategic initiatives, Made in China 2025 and China Standards 2035, where it seeks to dominate the global industry for manufacturing the most advanced semiconductors, which China today is unable to keep up with Taiwan's manufacturing capability. It wants to be able to project power deeper into the Indo-Pacific region in order to dominate the Western Pacific, to punch out beyond the first island chain, and to be able to set up parallel supply lines through the Indian Ocean and to the Middle East. But there's also something that's very important, ladies and gentlemen, and Jonathan Ward touched on this earlier this morning. We have to understand in the West the ideological commitment, and I also have to give credit to Matt Pottinger in his video. This regime is deadly serious about adhering to Leninist, absolutist, one-party control over all levers of the Chinese government, economy, military, and society. And if we don't take seriously that commitment, we don't understand how and why decisions are being made in China. Taiwan represents a democratic, free market, capitalist alternative for the ethnic Chinese people, right? Because the Taiwanese island is mostly occupied by former Han Chinese who fled the communists after the end of the Civil War in the 1940s. But this is a threat to the Chinese Communist Party's compact with the Chinese people that China is such a vast and complex society after 4,000 years of a grand civilization that only Leninist rule via the Communist Party can keep this country together, and Taiwan gives lie to that proclamation. And so the Chinese Communist Party, I believe, needs to smother the Taiwanese system. And whether they do it by a blockade, whether they do it by an invasion, again, lessons to be learned from Ukraine, one factor, but not the overriding factor here. So let me just talk a little bit about the U.S. role here, and then maybe we'll have some time for questions. Ladies and gentlemen, again, some stark reality. This is not 1995. The U.S. is not the sole global superpower any longer. And we have seen, as has been demonstrated by Christian in his overview and several of the presenters earlier, that China and Russia have been able to undermine the international trading system and the security architecture of their respective corners of the Eurasian continent. It's a very different world, and here in the United States, you're in the U.S. Senate today, ladies and gentlemen. When you're finished with all of your international security discussions today, follow what's happening with the U.S. Congress and our budget reconciliation process, which is rather messy and rather disordered. We don't do budgets normally in America. We haven't done them in 10 years normally. And what we have is a process now where we have run-amok budgets, deficits, and debt. The U.S. now is obligated to pay more than $1 trillion a year in federal debt service. That is an amount, ladies and gentlemen, that exceeds our annual defense budget. We're actually right now in a period of what I would call military scarcity in the United States. Our rockets, missiles, and ammunition inventories are depleted because of our supplies to Ukraine, now our supplies to Israel. We have an atrophied defense industrial base in the United States. We are years behind to developing a naval construction capability to even come close to where China is developing or has developed in recent years. And so we're in an era of what I would call hard truths and tough choices. America is unable to come to the rescue of every country that seeks our ability to support those countries in times of need. And we're going to be going now through a very critical transition into the Trump administration. I believe you will see a very determined effort to achieve a peace through strength approach to deterring our adversaries, especially China in Taiwan, to make any possible blockade or invasion of Taiwan as costly to the Chinese economy and especially to the Chinese Communist Party as possible, because we know the Communist Party is willing to absorb major losses in terms of Chinese lives and the quality of life to the Chinese people as long as their own grip on power is not threatened. So the question is, how do we work with Taiwan and our Asian allies to impose costs on China if they move in that direction? And there's going to be one more thing, ladies and gentlemen, to keep in mind, and that is Taiwan's demonstrated ability to commit to its own self-defense. Because right now, Taiwan claims that it is imminently terrified of a threat from China, this colossal military, and yet it's only spending about 2 to 2.5% of its GDP on defense. It needs to match the numbers that we see from countries like Poland at 4%, like Israel at 4.5%. If they're very, very threatened by China, they need to act like it. And so a laggard, blasé defense of the country is going to make it very difficult for any American president to deliver a primetime address and explain to the American people why we need to be ready to accept potentially thousands of American dead servicemen and women over an island, a rogue island, as China sees it, that most Americans don't have any concept of the importance to the American economy or to the global economy. So this is a very challenging period that we're facing. And I want to just leave you with this notion, ladies and gentlemen. Again, the era of easier decisions in Washington, based on political will, based on capacity, financial and military, are for now a part of the past. We will look to see if the new administration is able to rebuild American military capacity and American economic growth and power it to 3 to 4 or 5% of GDP, as is intentioned. And that will demonstrate a credible deterrent capability against China and other enemies. But I don't believe that Ukraine is going to be the deciding factor. I think it's going to be how the U.S. behaves towards China and on the world stage that will ultimately, hopefully, persuade China to not blockade, to not invade Taiwan, and to not trigger a world war. Thank you very much.